So we're back, episode 3. I don't know how we're still doing this, boys, but it's still good feedback. We have got a British white man, a British Pakistani, and a British Indian coming into a chai shop. Welcome to Chaiibucks. Before we start, boys, as you can see, I'm probably sat a little bit funny. I know it's been a bit of a bad day for you today, but and not a particularly great week for you either. But I thought I'd welcome you to today's podcast. Anything?
Shut up. Get on with it.
No words.
Not even. Sorry, I'm now going to sit here in the rest of this with my Burnley shirt. But yeah, welcome again. As always, we've got Mr. Sharafat Shah top left on me, and we've got Mr. Yasser Sufi, who I believe is still at Blackburn Rovers on the bottom of the screen. That's why his face is like that, and he's not smiling.
Did we say we're friends at any point? Why?
Friendship done.
I've always said I'll either convert you to be a Muslim or I'll convert you to be a Rovers fan. Either way, I'm winning. Whichever one.
Well, I think I know which one it will be, mate. So, after last week's episode, we did end fairly sharply, didn't we, on things, but it did start getting to the realms where it was getting quite heavy on the Ralph Yall stuff that we were talking about. A lot of feedback this week was something that we touched on towards the end, and it was about getting Shaz's perception of racism, I suppose, in this country from back when you were a boy, Shaz, and all the way up until the present day. And then obviously I think that's probably where Yasser and I can jump in and how it might have changed, how it might not have changed. Are there certain things that are acceptable? Are there certain things that that are done differently nowadays? But if you tell us your story, because you weren't born here either, were you? So I think it would be good to get your life from 19 when to now.
Yeah, I came over in 73, so I was just about sort of school starting age. Couldn't speak a word of English. Within a few days of me arriving into this country, I was chucked into a local primary school, and it wasn't pleasant to start with because I was being picked on from day one by all the kids around me, and probably because I was different. Probably because I couldn't understand what they were saying. And looking back on it now, I don't think that was racism. I think 6-year-old kids, I don't think they've learned racism by that age. So I think that was just kids being cruel and kids being horrible to each other. And those same kids stayed with me for the rest of my school life. That most of them became my friends and what have you, and that none of that turned into racism from any of those kids that were at school with me. The first time when I noticed that there was something that didn't quite feel right was at school, probably a year or 18 months later, when I was a little bit more with it. I could speak English. I was fluent in English. I know you probably say I'm not fluent now, but and I could make myself understood. And there was a teacher, and I've thought about whether I should name him or not, but I'm not going to name him. I mean, it was a long time ago in his very early 70s, and he may or may not be around, but I don't think it's fair for me to mention him. But he often referred to me as the chimpanzee. He often referred to me as the chimpanzee when he was saying things like, will the chimpanzee and friends get in line, please? Will the chimpanzee and friends stop running in the corridor, please? Can the chimpanzee be quiet, please? That was when I thought, oh, hang on a minute, that's doesn't feel right, does that? Because that's an adult saying that.
At this stage, could you understand what he was saying?
Yeah, of course I could. Yes, I know what.
How old were you then?
About 7. I was about 7. I was really short, but he referred to me as that, and that was when I thought, hang on a second, kids saying it's one thing, but this grown adult saying it is something totally different. On the flip side of that, we had a lovely old lady that lived next door to us, and this was in the early 70s, and she was in the 90s then. And nobody used to lock their front doors then. In the summer, they used to leave the front doors open, and people just used to walk in and out. And her husband, she just tells us about her husband being in the Merchant Navy, and he traveled all over the world. And she often said that they came across people that were captured and that were used as slaves. And then I'll never forget this. Then she sort of leaned over to me, nudged me, and she said, and this really lovely young man who befriended my husband, he was a nignog like you as well. But the thing is, I don't think she meant any malice by that, because it was what she said. It was what they did, and she said it affectionately as well. You know, because I don't think there were political correctness then, right? And I don't think she had the vocabulary to express what she meant, rather than just say he was a nignog like you. You know,
what's a nignog? By the way, I've never heard that term.
It's similar to
the N word in America.
Word,
what you'd hear in yeah, it's the N word basically.
The N word, yeah.
Is that not a term you've come across, Yas?
I think I said this on the last podcast we did. I've never had experienced anywhere near the level of racism Chaz is talking about right now. Nowhere near.
Well, there's a few other nuggets I'm gonna talk about. So Mrs. Platt was I think that was innocent. It was in a time when there was in South Africa when they were having issues as well. And I used to play cricket, and we had an under-15s team that came over from South Africa. And I must have been about 14, and I thought, you know, me rightly or wrongly thought all South Africans are racist. Anyway, these young lads came over, and I thought they'll be different towards me because they were all white. But they were anything but. They came, they shook hands with everybody, they called everybody sir, they were very polite. They sat with us and had lunch with us, they sat with us, and after the game had tea with us and everything. And they were lovely kids. And the management team that was with them as well, they were all lovely people as well. And I wondered, well, what's all the racism all about then? Because I couldn't see it in this group of people that were from this place that were, you know, racist at the time. And then older kids that used to live near us, they were often my friends, often they weren't my friends, often they used to play with me, often they used to beat me up.
Can I just ask you something?
Yeah.
Do you know where you grew up? Because I grew up very differently, and I don't know about Phil, but I grew up in a school where the primary school and the high school I went to, the people from South Asian, you know, heritage were the majority as opposed to the minority. So just give us a context into where you grew up and what that looked like.
I was one of two in the whole school.
Okay.
That was it, right? So yeah, growing up, these other kids, they used to often bully me, and they didn't, and then they were my friends, and they weren't. When they had other friends round, they used to show off and, you know, bully me again. Often they used to try to impress their other friends, especially if there were girls around and what have you. And I remember once they tried to pin me down and try to force feed me a little piece of bacon. I wriggled out of their grasps and managed to kick one of them. And fortunately, I was a bit of a fast runner then as well, so I ran away from them. But then the very next day, they were my friends again. They often used to say to me, "Can you say some Punjabi words?" I used to say the odd word to them. Say a sentence. And whenever I said a sentence, they said, "Oh, that's it. That's gibberish. That's blah, 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 blah." right? So they used to make me say sentences in front of other people as well. So that was not a pleasant time of my childhood. And then growing up, there was National Front was being noticed and discussed. And I don't know if you guys ever heard of National Front or NF. They used to see NF painted on walls and things like that. When we used to walk down the street, sometimes if it was a group of boys mainly, well, the other side of the road, we often used to get heckled. They used to come across the road and I've been spat at, or they shouted NF towards us. And that was pretty common in those days. And whenever Ramadan happened.
What year are we talking now, Shaz? What kind of age were you at when stuff like that was happening? When did that become?
That was about 75, 74,
so you
75.
were still fairly young then.
10 then, yeah. That's right. Yeah. And whenever Ramadan started, you know, we know what's happened with Ramadan this time around. Phil, you took part in it. Your school did the iftar event. Rovers did the iftar event. You know, Rovers even had the Eid prayers on the pitch. But even that, you know, when people used to say, "Oh, are you on that Ramadama ding dong?" Right? It used to get called that, you know, and nobody bat an eyelid at the time. Growing up in them days, I was scared of skinheads because they seemed violent and aggressive towards people like me. Then when I was about 16, about 16, things changed very quickly. For the better, I would say. Maybe because I was probably around older, you know, and more sensible people at the time. Or maybe those people that I surrounded myself with were people that I got on with, perhaps. You know, I played cricket a lot, as I said before, and there was came across some unacceptable banter on the pitch, which I put down to competitiveness, and also those words that were still considered acceptable. You know,
just to interrupt you there, sorry, mate. Just for our viewers and listeners, when you say you played cricket, it wasn't obviously in a backyard somewhere. You played for a club, didn't you?
Yeah.
And me and Phil, we've seen the picture of you, and you were the only South Asian heritage player in that team.
Yeah.
And you were breaking barriers in that day and age of someone who was in a all-white team, the only person playing. So you were playing to a quite good levels, got quite good standard, weren't you?
Yeah, I played for my local club. And my local club were absolutely brilliant. No negativity about my club. I'm still in touch with a lot of the people I used to play with, you know, so my club was absolutely fantastic. It's the banter on the pitch against the opposition that often it would not be tolerated now. But that was a time when I was old enough and I could handle myself and I could deal with it, and I gave it back as much as I got it as well. You know, so that actually stopped in its tracks whenever it started. And also in those days, TV programs didn't help. You know, programs like you guys will not remember this. Programs like Mind Your Language, It Ain't Half Hot Mum, right? And Rising Damp, right? And they all included humor that was based around the non-Indigenous people, and some of it was actually funny. And I think it was the acceptance of that humor that fueled these sort of things. The culture was accepting and non-critical of that attitude, you know, towards people like me. I went into higher education in the late 80s, and I witnessed zero discrimination. Okay, you're going to start seeing a change now. Okay, so I witnessed zero discrimination, zero negativity, The people around me at the time didn't think of me as any different to them. To them, I was just like anybody else. And I'm still in contact with most of my uni friends as well. Now, in fact, we meet up once a year as well.
Can I just come in there, Shaz? Do you think that's because of your life choices and the person that you are that you didn't see that? You know, obviously you've gone through a history of it being fairly prominent in your life, being one of two Asian kids in your school, and then obviously as you get older, you become a bit wiser as well, don't you? And you can sort of pick and choose who you can see might not be of that kind of culture. Do you think that's because it was because of, you know, maybe some of the television shows that it was coming, you know, they were trying to break barriers that way using comedy, or do you think it was still fairly rife and it was your choices that had made those some of those comments not as prominent to you? Do you understand what I mean?
I do. I don't think those programs will break any barriers. Those programs were there making, personally, I think, making fun of people.
Is that what you think they were for? They were making fun rather than trying to make humor out of a situation.
And because that's what they were there to make programs or whatever, because the vast majority of the general public found that funny. In fact, some of it was funny. It sounded funny as well. But I don't think those programs were breaking any barriers at all. No.
Just from Chaz, to then away from the programs, in terms of the news and the kind of government, you know, in terms of anything that was happening on a government level or anything happening in mainstream media, what was that like then in terms of antagonizing the National Front or other people to act in a certain way?
Well, yeah, the National Front were always the bad boys. Even the TV portrayed them as the bad boys. But there was they had a big presence everywhere. You know, people used to change their the way they look as well. I mentioned, you know, skinheads and people like that. You know, now somebody walks out with a skinhead, you don't think anything of it. But then when you used to see somebody with a skinhead, you used to think very negatively of them. You used to think that they were out to get you. You used to think that they were violent people. We don't think anything like that now. I mean, look, I'm nearly one as well. You know, so you know, we don't think that of that. The attitudes have totally changed. You know.
Yeah.
So into the 90s then, and onto work. I worked down south. Zero, nothing at all. I didn't have any negative experiences. Went out of an evening and what have you. I did see glimpses of the old attitude, right? But it wasn't as prevalent as it was before. Then I started my business. Again, it was probably in the mid-90s, which is now thankfully, and I'm very grateful. It's a very successful business. We'll be going nearly 30 years, and it's a pleasure to work with some of our customers and suppliers. It seems like such a different world now. I got to watch my, you know, beloved Blackburn Rovers and my son, and compared to the football matches in the 70s and 80s, again, it's a different world. There is now zero. Yes, you can back this up. There's zero tolerance. That is the word that's used now. Zero tolerance to anything remotely like what it was like in the 70s and 80s. In fact, I wasn't a football fan or a supporter in the 70s and 80s, but from what I remember seeing on the TV, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of trouble going on around football matches. And I don't think me going to those football matches at the time, looking the way I do, I don't think that would help the situation. But now it's an absolute pleasure to be there. You know, we see people around us, we speak to everybody, we say hello to everybody, you know, and laws are now in place, right? And which makes things illegal that were accepted in those days, you know. More awareness now of the differences and cultures, and the involvement of people of all faiths and backgrounds and cultures in each other's activities. People are involved with each other a lot more now. And Phil, you know, as I mentioned before, you took part in Ramsden at your school, Rovers, you know, Eid on the pitch. I mean, how does that happen? You know,
because of this guy, yeah, things like that.
Absolutely, and a lot of our listeners and viewers would know that as well. You know, but I'm just trying to paint a picture as to what is happening now as to what was happening before.
The one thing I'll argue against that, though, is I do agree with you in terms of when you grew up, your experience of growing up will be very, very different to what me and Phil have experienced, you know. And I've said it, you know, besides the P word, I've never been called anything or felt, you know, degraded in the way where, you know, you were when you were at your primary school. But I would also say, as someone who's very proudly British, someone who's very proud of my identity personally, I would still say that in society itself, although that kind of language is no longer acceptable, people still judge people based on their differences.
Absolutely, they do.
And people still make their mind up about someone based on their difference. And the subject of today in terms of racism, and racism is not exclusive to people who look like you and me, Shaz. Racism is, you know, to anyone who's not deemed to be someone who is originally from the British Isles or anywhere else for that matter. And
I think, yes, there will always be discrimination of some sort, no matter how hard you work, no matter what rules you. I mean, look, that discrimination can be against, you know, I'm just picking something out of the air, against ginger people, for instance. You know, they can be discriminated against, you know, and people that have a, I don't know, a disability of some sort.
But
that's it will never stop.
That's the key difference now, and this is where I get quite a bit passionate about this, you know, in terms of this, is someone who will say to, I've had people in conversation say to me, I know how someone like you, for example, in the 70s feels. I was discriminated against because I've got ginger hair, or I've got freckles on my face, or I've got a learning disability, or I've got this, that, the other. It's a whole different, for me, racism and what you're talking about, what you experienced in those 70s and 80s, in the 70s and 80s, and some people might still be experiencing in whatever form. We've had some high-profile case recently. We've had England after the World Cup and 3 lads who missed the penalties. We've had some really high-profile cases, but that is a whole different level of hatred, and that's a whole different level of let's just say hate towards someone because of the, you know, either the color of their skin, the background where they come from, and I you know, a lot of people say I can empathize with someone who, you know, you can't unless you've been subjected to that. You can't unless you've been made to feel that you do not belong in a certain place. And we're talking about a lot of different people, you know, we're not talking about people who just look like me and you. There's, you know, across the world, there's people who are whatever race, whatever color of skin they're from. If they feel, you know, if they feel like they do not belong in that place for whatever reason, people are quick to judge someone who doesn't look like them. We're not, you know, and racism, you mentioned something there where people, skinheads, National Front, but racism exists in all forms, and racism exists between, and I'll say this quite, you know, quite openly, racism exists between British Indians and British Pakistanis and British Punjabis and people like that as well. So all of it is still there. It's just the fact that it doesn't get talked about as much because it's not as high profile until it becomes national news or media, something like that. And it's those sort of things where personally I would want to highlight, because even though you're saying, and it's really good, and my experience is the same, by the way, 80s, 90s, you know, in early 2000s, growing up, experienced very little racism. However, what Phil just mentioned to you, I grew up in a very predominantly, you know, South Asian Muslim background school, high school, and my surroundings were very, very different. Had I been in a different surrounding, what would my experience be of that? And that's the important bit. And the one thing I do want to mention is currently, for right now, we've probably got the most diverse government in power. But in my lifetime, besides Boris Johnson's letterboxes comment, I've never experienced or seen so much hatred right from the top in terms of marginalizing a specific group. And those are things where you think to yourself, that's people who are children of migrants, and that's people who do look like you and me, but they're marginalizing a group. And it's really, really important that a racist or racism isn't exclusive to one race. It exists in a lot of different forms.
But it probably is exclusive to one race if there's only that one race there at the time. And I think that's the issue that I had at the time, where it was just me and my family in the area that we lived. Now, in that area, it's probably similar to where you're from now, yes. But I think that was an era where that was accepted. It was accepted, and the sort of things that were said, it was what was said, and people didn't really bat an eyelid. And I'll tell you another, talking about going full circle and things improving. A very good friend of mine who I went to uni with, and she's called, I will mention her. And a few years ago, I jokingly sent her an Eid Mubarak message, right? And to my shock, I got replied back saying Khair Mubarak. I thought, what? How does that work? How do you know that? So, it's people then are aware of what Eid is, and aware of what people say on Eid, and aware of what the reply is to saying Eid Mubarak to somebody, But look, having talked about all the negativity in my early years, this country is, where I spent all my life. This country is where I have all my family. This country is where all the people I love live here. This is where I have my business. This is my home, and nowhere else am I so proud to call my home. I'm very proud to be British.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud that this British homeland of mine has changed so much in my lifetime, for the better. And in another lifetime, God knows how much more accepting it would be of different cultures and religions and different beliefs and ways of thinking.
Yeah. I want to, that's a really, really, really important word you just said there, Shaz, and I want to bring Phil on this one, because you just said it, accepting someone for who they are and what's important to them. And even though I'll never accept the fact that this, the guy is wearing the color that he's wearing right now, that will something I will never ever accept. But I had a similar instance today at work where a blonde woman, she must be in her 30s, early 30s, tattoos on her neck. And I went and I was just walking towards her, and she was with a group of people. She turned around and she just said, "Assalamu alaikum." And I was just like, wow. And that meant so much to me. That little thing meant so much to me, that person had said that greeting to me, knowing how important it be to me. And we talk about acceptance, and we will, we've spoke about this a few times, but those listeners and viewers who don't know this, when Phil took part in Ramadan and took part in the 29 days and learned about the month and learned about what was involved, and that understanding, that's what it takes, where we understand each other. And it's got to be both ways. Has to be both ways, where we understand what's important to each other. And you talked about some of the stuff we've done in terms of as a football club, but that's what we've predominantly done, is said to people, this is what's important to each, the prayers is important to us, the non-alcohol is important to us, and we're not forcing anything on anyone. It's just saying this is what's important. So what Phil's done, over the last month in terms of understanding and that acceptance, it's massive.
Absolutely.
But being the white British man in the room in our chai shop, it'd be really, really important, for you to kind of share what your experience of racism growing up and currently is as well, mate.
Before Phil talks about that, Phil, guys, I think sometimes people can try too hard at being non-racist as well.
I think I know the story you're going to go with. You.
I'll let you tell them that story. This is about the Rovers Iftar Day.
Yeah, so we were stood, weren't we? I was stood with Shaz and his son Danny, and we were having a bit of a natter, and then a guy approached. We were stood at the window, weren't we? We were watching the game. Yeah. Was the game going at the time?
The game, yeah.
Or it was just starting, and Shaz was saying, "Oh, I sit over there, third one in," and we were like pointing over, and this guy appears from like behind us, and he goes, "Oh, I normally sit in the top at the far end," and he looked at Danny, didn't he? Your son, and went, "I've got a few Asians sat around me." And at that point, like we all looked at each other and went, if he was saying that, if he were talking to me, that wouldn't have been a comment that came out of his mouth. He wouldn't have said, "I've got a load of white folks sitting here and sat near me." Right. And it was like such a comment that he really didn't need to make, just to try and show that it's the old, innit? When someone says, "You're a racist," "Oh, one of my best mates black."
Yeah, so
it doesn't do you any favors.
Sometimes people try a bit too hard.
Just on that though, I'm going to disagree with you there, because I don't know any other way he can describe, other than saying who he sat with in a what would you say he might say in that?
Well, I wouldn't have said anything. I'd have said I sit over there. Why would I need to say? I wouldn't say if there were loads of women sat with me. I wouldn't say if there were loads of kids in that area. I wouldn't say if there were loads of other white folk in that area. It was an irrelevant.
But isn't he trying to say that he's noticed more people? I don't know.
I don't think that was the purpose of why he was saying that. I think the purpose
it was an iftar event.
Because it was an iftar event, right? I think he was going out of his way to say that where he sits, there's a lot of Asian people that sit around him as well.
In a positive way, isn't it?
Well, it certainly wasn't negative.
It was certainly there's nothing negative about that. I just think this is what I'm saying about people trying a little bit too hard sometimes.
But it's an important bit. It's really, really important you raise this, because and a lot of times people do not know what to say and when to say. And a lot of the times people do not have these conversations because of the fact that if they might say something wrong. Me personally, and this is the thing where if someone said that to me, I wouldn't be offended.
You weren't offended.
No one was offended.
We weren't offended. We're just saying it's something that me and Phil were talking about afterwards, and say, well, and Phil actually said, well, he wouldn't have said that if there's a lot of white people sat around him.
If it was any other demographic he was talking about, and we weren't stood at an iftar event, he would not have mentioned who was sat around him. But it certainly wasn't said in an offensive manner. It's a bit like Shaz was saying earlier. Back in the 70s and 80s, when things were more acceptable to say, even though technically they were never acceptable, if they were said in the manner in which they were meant, and it was meant in a kind tone, then that's just the way. And he certainly wasn't being offensive when he said it.
It wasn't being offensive. It was very affectionate the way he said it as well.
Yeah, and he was just trying to say, like, weren't he, that I'm also here as well. And I think it was more of a proof, wasn't it, that he wasn't racist, and that it was cute to see, and but someone's coming up, aren't they?
It's an important point for me, because a lot of the times conversations like this, people are afraid to have with someone, not knowing what the right thing or the wrong thing to say is.
But that's why we're here. This is what we've started this for, isn't it? So we can have that conversation between the three of us, because there's loads of times I ring you guys up and go, seriously, lads, what's this, that, and that? Will this look bad? What's the optics of this? Can I ask you this? It might be a really stupid question, and half of the time you laugh at me, half of the time you say, no, it's not a silly question. But that's why we've started this, isn't it? For that conversation, because people are scared to raise the conversation nowadays, and that's where we're at.
100% agree with you. But you've got to create that where people feel relaxed enough, safe enough to ask anything. And it goes with anything you don't understand. There's a lot of things I don't understand about a lot of people, but unless you're in a safe space where you can have those conversations, it becomes where people are too easily offended these days.
Yeah.
And people too easily take offense to something when they don't need to. Whereas that person is just being inquisitive. That person is just trying to find something, out, and you pointing them in the right direction might help them in the future have that conversation.
See, I think the rules change as well quite often, don't they? I think it's quite difficult. I think sometimes, especially for generations that might not be as social media savvy, it's quite difficult for them to be able to keep what's allowed and what's not allowed anymore. However, that's just the way the cookie crumbles at the moment. But I do think that's a really strong reason why we've done this, isn't it? It's to start having those conversations, because again, we don't always agree with things. We're not trying to change anybody's mind or opinions on anything. We want that open conversation. We want to create a safe environment for people to be able to ask us questions, because sometimes I don't know, and like I say, I'll ring you two. Depending on what it might be, and it's about opening conversations, dialogue with each other. It's not a difficult thing to do, and if you don't know, you don't know, but ask it in the right manner. And it's the way that you say things and approach things that make it an okay question to ask. If you're doing it from the heart and you're not doing it out of a place of malice, then 9 times out of 10, it's not a horrible question.
And I think if that person has that trust in you, and if that person knows you to a level where they can have that conversation openly with you, a lot of the times they will feel in a safe space where they will feel I can say something and I won't be judged on what I'm saying. And it's really, really important we do that, because unless people feel comfortable asking difficult questions, how else are we going to change anything? If someone asks me something about my prayers, about my home life, about my religion, ignorance sometimes is, the antithesis of creating, those kind of racist tropes where people might see something as thinking, right, you know what, that's racist, but it's not. No. It's just that person being inquisitive.
And I think that's the rise of social media as well, isn't it? That people might genuinely go on there asking a question, but be smacked down so quickly with these tags of racism that they then think, oh my God, I don't know what that is. I don't dare ask that again, or I don't want to broach that. Or, somebody said I'm racist about asking questions like that I'm now going to just totally, dismiss those kind of people now, or that religion, or whatever it might be. And I don't think we help ourselves sometimes. So I certainly think that, if anybody does have any questions that's either listening or watching, we're more than happy to answer them, as long as from a kind and a kind-hearted place. We'll always endeavour to do that, won't we, gents? We've got about a minute left, so we are going to wrap it up there. It's been an interesting journey, that, Shaz. Just in a quick one, do we think it's getting better? Do we
Absolutely.
think that we're moving forward?
Much better. Like I said before, this is an absolute different world to what it was in the 70s and 80s.
I only think it can get better when you have social equality. And when I mean social equality, we have people representing in all forms of life, across mainstream media, across government, across all positions, where people will, from different social backgrounds, can represent and can have that diverse opinion. That's
Brilliant.
when we see real change.
We've got an Indian Prime Minister now. Come on, how much more diverse can you get now?
We're not going into the politics route.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
That's it this week from Chaiibucks Chat. Please like, subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. Leave us a comment and let us know what your thoughts are. Gentlemen, thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you.